everybody, it's Sarah, and as you can probably tell by the books on my shelves behind me, I am quite the avid fantasy reader. And so I thought, even though I saw a lot of people do this already on BookTube, I thought I wanted to maybe do my take on recommendations for people who maybe have never read fantasy before but want to start reading fantasy, or maybe even have already started reading fantasy but want to get to more advanced fantasy books. And I think I have some books that maybe have not been on these recommendation lists before, and the way I want to do this is, first I want to kind of talk in general about what types of books I would recommend the different people, depending on how far into fantasy you are already, and then also of course give recommendations for those books. Let me start of course with recommendations for people who have never read fantasy before and want to get started out. The first group of books that I would recommend is retellings. And why would I recommend retellings for someone who's starting out in fantasy? First of all, because a lot of times in retellings we're familiar with the general story, so at least the story doesn't hold a lot of our concentration, so we can concentrate more on the maybe more unfamiliar aspects, the world building and so on in the story, the magic aspects. And then the second thing is that a lot of times in retellings I have found the fantasy elements aren't that prominent, is what I would say. So I think that's also a reason why retellings are an easy way to get into fantasy. And the books I would recommend for the beginning are Madeline Miller's two releases, The Song of Achilles and Circe. These two are both Greek mythology retellings. One isn't a direct retelling of any specific myth, but just kind of Madeline Miller looking at the different mythologies where Circe appears and trying to piece together her life from them. And The Song of Achilles, of course, is a retelling of the Iliad, or of the part of the Iliad that focuses on Achilles. And I do have an entire review on this one, so I will leave that link down below and up there. And yeah, the fantasy elements very much only focus on the Greek gods, and otherwise they are not that fantastical at all, so I think it's a great place to start if you want to get into fantasy. Another great place to start are, I think, more historical fantasy books, especially if you maybe come from being a historical fiction reader. And what I would count as historical fantasy are fantasy books that are set in our world, but just in past times. And a lot of times they just add elements like fairies or maybe dragons, but not a lot of fantasy to it. And the series I want to recommend for that is the Seven Waters series by Juliet Marillet. A lot of historical fantasy I have found, at least the stuff that I have read, is actually set in Ireland or Scotland, up north, northwest, I guess, of Europe, on those two funny islands, because I think Celtic folklore kind of lends itself very, very well to fantasy concepts. But anyway, the Seven Waters series is a series of not 7 but 6 books, and it's kind of a family saga. And the first book is actually a retelling as well. It's a retelling of the story of the 6 swans, and we follow Sorka, whose brothers have been turned into swans by an evil sorceress, and she has to knit shirts for them out of nettles and is not allowed to utter a sound while doing that. I think this story again is very well suited for beginners because there isn't a lot of fantastical elements in this, especially in this first book, aside from her brothers being turned into swans. Later books have appearances by the Fae and Fairy and the Tuatha Dé, I think they're called, the Irish fairy folk. And yeah, so I think this would be a perfect place to start getting into fantasy, although the writing is very lyrical, so if you do not enjoy that, be aware of that. Next, I would also recommend, if you get started into fantasy, to start with YA fantasy. And the reason for that isn't only because generally I would say that YA fantasy isn't quite as complex as adult fantasy, but I also think that it's easier to get into because a lot of times in YA fantasy there is a very, very big focus on romance. And so there's not as much time spent on building the world, on building some type of conflict, but that time is just spent on the romance. And of course, YA, the writing style isn't everyone's type, but I still wanted to recommend it. And the book I chose, which funnily enough, I do not enjoy the second book in that series, but the book I chose was A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Camera, and I would just read this as a standalone, to be honest. But the reason why I chose this specifically is because I do think that out of all the YA high fantasy books on my shelf, this is the easiest to get into. Because there isn't a lot of time spent world building. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and one of the main characters, Harper, is actually from our world. So if there is something new, it's kind of the way it's put into the story isn't like, here, this is it, and you have to understand it. But the way it's used is kind of, it's explained to Harper, and so you understand it as well. And of course, Beauty and the Beast retelling, the story follows Harper, and she is kind of kidnapped to this different realm to fall in love with a prince who once every season turns into a monster and kills everyone. So yeah, YA fantasy is definitely a place to start, but also, and that can be said about historical fantasy as well, try to find books that don't mainly focus on the world building, that don't mainly focus on the fantastical elements, but that just have something like a romance that takes up a lot of the time in the book. Along the lines of finding something familiar in fantasy books and genre that I think is definitely good to start out if you want to get into fantasy is urban fantasy. And I have two series here. The first is The Invisible Library by Genevieve Cogman, which is also kind of historical fantasy, and this follows Irene, who is a librarian, and it's set in a world with a bunch of different alternate universes that are all kind of different timelines, I would say, of our world and of our history. And Irene's task as a librarian is to go through these different worlds and steal unique books. And the reason why I think this is perfect for starting out in fantasy is that this starts very simple in the first book, very simple concepts, but it kind of expands, and the world expands as each book goes along. And so kind of you can get used to a few elements in the first book, and then there are some more elements in the second book and some more again in the third, and so on. So I think this is a good place to start as well. Also, they're really quick and easy reads. And the second series I have is The Other series by Anne Bishop, and this also kind of is set in an alternate version of our world where humans live side by side with the others, who are basically elementals. They are werewolves, they are shapeshifters, they are vampires, and so on. And we follow our main character Meg, who is a Cassandra Song. And what that means is that if her skin is cut, she sees visions. And she has spent her whole life in a compound where her cuts basically have been sold to the highest bidder, and her visions have been sold to the highest bidder. And the story starts as she escapes this compound and she finds refuge with the others. And the others and the humans don't really get along that well, and a lot of like conflicts ensue. Big triggers for self-harm though, because again, Meg is a Cassandra Song and she has visions when she cuts herself or when she is cut, so be aware of that. But again, this is a fantasy book that I would recommend as a starting point because the world is very familiar. It's basically modern times, but it's just everything's called differently, and you have vampires and shapeshifters and such, and they have their own customs. But there's still a lot of familiar stuff in this, so definitely can recommend for beginners. And then the last recommendations I have for like beginners is kind of more of a concept compared to just something that I concretely say is a genre or a certain type of books that you could read. And you'd probably have to watch reviews to know if the books that you want to read are those type of books. And that is books that very much follow tropes and very much follow familiar stories again. Because I think even if you're not an avid fantasy reader, you're probably familiar with movies like The Lord of the Rings, and you maybe know those stories. So the book that I would recommend, even though I would probably not recommend it to like people who already have read a lot of fantasy and have never read this when they were younger, because like that's kind of the two types of people so far that I've found either you have read this book when you were younger and you loved it, or you're someone who reads a lot of fantasy and read it when you're older and you're like, what the fuck, this is just Lord of the Rings rehashed, because it basically is. And that is The Inheritance Cycle, or Eragon by Christopher Paolini. I still haven't finished the whole of the series, but I do still think that at least the first book is a good place to start if you're just getting started out in fantasy, because yes, it is already a high fantasy book, but it's, as I said, basically Lord of the Rings. So if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, I would not recommend starting with Lord of the Rings, because that shit is hard to read. It's a whole different writing style. It's very classical fantasy, but this is Lord of the Rings, but in easy and in YA. So definitely a place where I would recommend you start. And then also something I can recommend, although I didn't really have any books that I would recommend for beginners, like if you've never read any fantasy before, but also start out with standalones. I have right here Elantris by Brandon Sanderson and The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, because I do think it's kind of less intimidating to get into standalones. There's often a lot less time spent at the beginning of the book with world building, because of course if you have a huge series with 10 plus books, then often quite a big chunk of the first book is spent with world building and with setting up the characters and so on. And since you do not have to have a huge world in the background with standalones, that's often a lot less the case with them, and you often get into the action quite a bit faster. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for standalones, and maybe they would be a place to start. Although I would recommend like Elantris more than The Priory of the Orange Tree, because I think it's just a much more fast-paced book. Next, I have 3 more series that are high fantasy, because I think that's actually what we think of when we say fantasy most of the time, that I think are more beginner friendly, maybe not as your first series ever, but I do think that they're quite easy to get into. The first of those is the Tyrell Lane trilogy by Anne Bishop, which starts with The Pillars of the World, and this is a series where there's 2 different races. One is the humans and the other one is the Fae. The Fae do not live on Earth, they live in Tyrell Lane, and one day Tyrell Lane just starts vanishing and no one knows why. And that's kind of where this starts, and our main character Ari kind of seems to be the answer to the secret why Tyrell Lane starts vanishing. The reason why I think this is good to start is because this is definitely one of those series that has a smaller cast of characters in the first book and then expands the world. The first book very much is set just in this one village, and then later on we kind of get to see the country, we kind of see the continent and so on. So I think that's why it's good to start, because again, it's always nice if you start small and then start expanding and you don't get kind of thrown into the cold water all at once. And then the other reason why I think this is also good is because at parts this can be quite trope heavy, which sometimes gets annoying for more well-versed fantasy readers, or like older fantasy readers, older as in having read fantasy for a longer time. However, tropes again give that familiarity kind of, and you have just parts of the story where you don't have to concentrate so much, and so you can give more concentration to understanding the world building, for example. So that's why I think this one is great. Next, I have the Black Magicians trilogy by Trudy Canavan. The first one is The Magician's Guild, and this one follows Sunia, who is a young girl who lives in the slums of the city. However, it is discovered that she has quite a huge potential for magic, so she is given a place in the Magician's Guild, even though usually only aristocrats get a place in there. The reason why I think this is perfect as one of your first high fantasy books is because, first of all, I read it with 12 years old, and if I understood it with 12, then I'm sure you can do it as well, even if you've only read a few high fantasy books. And the second thing is that this is not exactly YA, and the reason why I don't think it's YA is that Sunea basically is the only young character, even though the age of characters isn't everything that makes a book YA or not YA, of course. but she is the only young character. Aside from the first book, there's a second one. Aside from that, most of the characters are middle-aged and older, but it is still written in a very YA manner, I would say, and it is still very easy to follow. And again, this is also one of the books where it starts small and then expands. The first book is very much just Sonea getting into the Magician's Guild and understanding kind of what's happening in the Magician's Guild, and then in the second and third book it expands to the city, to the country, to the politics of the world. And so yeah, another book that I would recommend. Then the third one I'm kind of recommending on a limb because I do not know how easy it is to get into right away, but I would still say that The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski, which is the first book in the Witcher series, is a good way to get started into fantasy because it is just short stories and there's not too much world building yet. And it's just really easy to understand. It's really easy to understand what a witcher is. And he's basically just fighting a different monster in every single short story. So I think that at least this first book is really easy to read, and you can decide afterwards if you want to continue on or not. I haven't continued on yet. I do have the second book already, but I just haven't found the time yet to start it. And then I have two recommendations for people who maybe have read a bit more high fantasy already or have read a lot of high fantasy already, and these are just kind of random recommendations, to be honest. One of them is a recommendation because I think if you've read a lot of high fantasy already, I think for most people sooner or later there are certain series that are gonna be on your radar and that you maybe want to start reading. And one of those series is definitely a Game of Thrones, and I think before you get into a Game of Thrones, if you're not feeling comfortable yet in fantasy and if you haven't read a lot of fantasy yet, if it's not your main genre or anything, I would recommend you start with the Hydron Chronicles first, because it's basically a Game of Thrones but on a smaller scale. This follows Marla Wolfblade, who is the sister to the High Prince of her country. However, her brother is not intent on marrying at all, and as the princess of her country, basically her only reason for existence is to be married off and to gain her brother political friends. She, however, is determined to not let herself be just a pawn in the political game, but to just find her own friends and find her own enemies and fight her own battles. This is a political fantasy, and I think it's definitely a good way to start if you want to know if that's even your type of fantasy style, and if you even want to get into A Song of Ice and Fire. Because I would say if you really don't like this book, then you won't like A Song of Ice and Fire either. And this series is only 3 books in total, and they're not 1,000 pages each. And then along the same lines, of course, I think if you've read fantasy for a while, everyone sooner or later wants to get started with one of those epic fantasy series. And with epic, I mean 5+ books. And maybe you don't know with which one you should start. I would say the series you should start with definitely isn't A Song of Ice and Fire, isn't The Wheel of Time, but I think the easiest series to start with is The Stormlight Archived by Brandon Sanderson. This series, of course, is not finished yet. The 4th book is going to be published this year, and it's going to be a 10-book series in total with 2 5-book arcs. And I won't get into what it's about because that would be way too complicated, as with all epic fantasy series. I mean, a lot of high fantasy series are already pretty hard to quickly summarize, but with epic fantasy series, it's basically impossible. However, I think this is easier to start with because, for example, with a Game of Thrones, you're very much thrown right into it with 50,000 characters. The Wheel of Time is just hugely intimidating just because it's 15 books, and I think just Brandon Sanderson finds the perfect balance between having a lot of world building already in the first book, having a lot of stuff happen already in the first book, but still kind of, again, starting very small, having your basic set of characters, your 3 or 4 point of views that you have in the first book, and then expanding those point of views in the later books, and then kind of slowly adding to the center cast of characters. So yeah, that's why I think this would be perfect for you if you've read a lot of high fantasy already, but haven't read that much like epic high fantasy yet. And yeah, that was it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too long for you. And tell me in the comments down below if you want to pick up any of those books. If you read a lot of fantasy already and for some reason watch this video, tell me in the comments down below, do you agree with my picks? I really would like to see what you'd have picked. If you have someone who wants to get into fantasy, what you'd recommend them. And as always, all the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!